Dear brothers and sisters, today I speak to you about a great saint, a man of faith and dedication, Don Giovanni Bosco. He dedicated his life to the salvation of souls, especially those of young people, fighting with all his strength to rescue souls from the clutches of evil. His mission was directly inspired by the Lord, and in a dream he was granted a vision of hell itself, a warning for all of us, an invitation to avoid falling into the traps of the devil. Let me tell you about this vision so that you may understand its profound meaning and the warning that Don Bosco offers us. It was the night of April 17, 1868, when Don Bosco was visited by a heavenly guide, a distinguished figure who, like an angel, led him through a terrifying journey so that he could see and witness the traps the devil sets for the souls of young people. At the beginning of the dream, Don Bosco found himself in a vast, arid plain, a true, lifeless desert. The guide invited him to walk along a seemingly beautiful path, surrounded by hedges and magnificent flowers. But alas, that path, though appearing flat, actually descended into the abyss, leading with it the young people of the oratory, many of whom were unaware of the danger that awaited them. Don Bosco watched in horror as many of those young people fell along the way, caught by invisible snares that dragged them down into a frightening descent. These snares, the guide said, were the devil's traps: pride, disobedience, envy, impurity, gluttony, sloth, and wrath. These were the vices that chained souls and dragged them towards ruin. The greatest number of victims were those bound by the snares of pride, impurity, and disobedience. Don Bosco noticed how well hidden these snares were, almost invisible, and many young people fell into them without even realizing it. Some snares were set close to the ground, others hung from above, ready to catch anyone who passed by. Don Bosco wanted to examine one of these snares and pulled it towards himself, but he could not move it. He then decided to follow the string of the snare to its origin, eventually arriving at the entrance of a horrible cave. In front of him appeared a gigantic and repulsive monster, holding the ends of a rope with its claws to which all those snares were tied. The guide then said, "Now you know who drags young people into the abyss." Don Bosco immediately recognized that it was the devil himself who set those snares to make his young people fall into hell. As they continued their journey, Don Bosco and the guide found themselves in front of a path that became increasingly steep and rugged, full of holes, pebbles, and boulders. The way was difficult, and the landscape grew ever more desolate and dark. At the end of that path, they came upon an immense and shadowy building, a place that struck fear just by looking at it. Above a very high door was a frightening inscription: "Here there is no redemption." It was the entrance to hell. The guide, grabbing Don Bosco by the arm, said to him, "Look!" Trembling, Don Bosco raised his eyes and saw a young man rushing down towards that door. His hair was disheveled, his eyes wide with terror, his arms stretched out in front of him as if to protect himself from the fall. Don Bosco wanted to run to help him, but the guide held him back, saying, "Do you think you can stop one who flees from the wrath of God?" The young man crashed against the bronze door, which opened with a deafening roar. Behind it, other doors opened, one after another, up to 1,000, and from each came globes of fire while the young man sank into that abyss. Don Bosco saw other young people falling, one after another, screaming in terror as they fell into the abyss. Some were pushed by wicked companions, others were dragged by their own bad habits. The guide explained, "Here is the main cause of so many damnations: companions, bad books, perverse habits." Seeing the ruin of so many young people, Don Bosco exclaimed in despair, "Is it then useless for us to work in our colleges if so many young people end up like this?" The guide replied, "This is their current state, and if they were to die, they would certainly end up here. But there is still hope, as long as you do everything you can." Don Bosco then found himself facing a difficult choice. The guide invited him to enter through those doors, saying, "Come inside too, you will learn many things." Don Bosco, with a heavy heart, followed the guide into a narrow and dark corridor until they reached a gloomy opening with the inscription, "Ibuni impi in ignem aeternum," the wicked shall go into eternal fire. The guide opened the opening and led Don Bosco inside. What Don Bosco saw filled him with indescribable terror. An immense cavern opened up before him, disappearing into the bowels of the earth. Everything was glowing from the fire, the walls, the ceiling, the floor. All was white and blazing from the heat. It was not the fire we know on earth with flickering flames. It was a fire that burned without consuming anything, a heat beyond imagination. Don Bosco saw a young man fall into that cavern, emitting a sharp scream as he was swallowed by the fire. He recognized the young man as one of the boys from his oratory. "Isn't this one of my young men?" he asked the guide. "Unfortunately, yes," was the answer. Don Bosco saw other young people follow the same fate, falling into the fire and remaining there, motionless, glowing like statues of pain. The guide explained that these young people had been warned 1,000 times, but they had refused God's mercy, deliberately choosing sin. Filled with horror, Don Bosco exclaimed, "What must be the despair of these unfortunate ones who have no hope of escape?" The guide urged him to reflect on the gravity of sin and the necessity of sincere repentance. The guide then ordered Don Bosco to touch one of the walls of the cavern to understand what hell was like. Don Bosco hesitated, but the guide forced him. As soon as his hand touched that wall, he felt such intense pain that he screamed and awoke from the dream. His hand was swollen, and in the following days the skin on his palm peeled off. It was a tangible sign of the reality he had seen and of the unimaginable pain of hell. Brothers and sisters, Don Bosco's message is clear. Hell is a reality that we cannot ignore. God's mercy is infinite, but it requires a response from us, an act of repentance and conversion. We cannot live in indifference. We cannot let the devil lay his snares around us and our loved ones. We must be vigilant, pray, confess sincerely, and avoid anything that could lead us away from God. Don Bosco teaches us that salvation is possible, that grace is available to all of us. But we must do everything within our power to avoid hell and to lead souls, especially those of our young people, towards salvation. May the Lord give us the strength to follow the path of virtue, to remain united with Him through prayer, the sacraments, and brotherly love. May the Lord bless you and protect you always.